said, just as just as you are and need to be. And Charles is going to go ahead and record today to make this available to anyone who couldn't be here afterwards, but won't be recording the breakout discussions at the end. Those will be just for you. And Charles will also be making the slides available from today's talk. I will say that I am the kind of presenter who likes to bring a lot to the table and then kind of go with the flow based on what seems right for the group. So if there are things that we don't get to, or if there are pieces of information on an individual slide that you might miss, you will have a copy of these to take along with you today. So I'm just going to get started and share my screen here. And Amy, will you just let in anyone who might be coming in a little late?
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, so welcome to Cultural Competency and the Nervous System. And so we'll be going today till about 1:30 p.m. So I just wanted to say a few things about the topic while you're looking over the agenda today. So the first thing is that both Amy and myself are approaching these topics as lay people. We are not mental health professionals. We are fellow educators, adult educators. And we're approaching these topics, I am based on my observations, conversation with other educators, some tools I've gathered, and reflection, all from the perspective of an educator, not a mental health professional, not certified in teaching any particular method of working with nervous systems. I also wanted to just say kind of big picture why we wanted to put this workshop together. So bringing these two things into conversation that aren't always in the same conversation. So just kind of reflecting in some of our conversations with each other about teaching on some of the ways that social safety and personal safety are always combined. And how applying the framework of cultural competency as a lens and a practice to continually strive for and reflect on, along with some trauma-informed knowledge and tools to do with the nervous system and regulation, has worked together in the classroom, both in terms of setting an environment for learning and safety, and then also going back and troubleshooting when something might seem off or become difficult. So we're thinking about the entwinement of personal and social experiences and how we bring these along in our bodies. So that's kind of the framework within which I'm approaching these topics. Okay, I think I talked about the business already. This is our agenda. We'll begin by just talking a brief intro. We'll talk a little bit about, okay, what do we mean by cultural competency? What does this look like in the classroom? We're going to do a bit of a deep dive into the nervous system today and some techniques for co-regulation, how we can bring this into our spaces. We'll kind of do like a call, a group share, brainstorm about cultivating brave spaces and ways that we can kind of take these bodies of knowledge and bring them together as educators with our learners. And there will be time at the end for some breakout room discussion. So to begin with, I just would invite you to answer in the chat. Please go ahead and share your name, your organization, and the population that you teach. So I'm Laura Newman. Right now I teach at the College of New Jersey. I've been teaching there since 2017. I teach lit classes, I teach creative writing and gender studies there. And I previously taught in adult education settings at community colleges here in Philadelphia and in Washington State, where I taught mainly literacy and developmental English. Amy, would you like to go ahead and unmute and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So, hi, I'm Amy Ballard. I'm happy to be here with you all today. My background for the past 10 years has been in all different types of adult education. So, I've been in HSE, I've done college writing composition classes, and worked with a lot of the ESOL community as well. So, it's been fun to experiment a little bit of all of that, and excited to have all of you here today.
Okay, great. And here we are. So to begin, we know that we can't really learn when we're stressed. Um, so Amy's going to lead us in a little grounding activity today, just to invite us into the space with each other. And it's fine to participate. Again, camera on and off, just listening, really in whatever way is right for you in this moment.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And we love doing these because they're also an opportunity for you to take something to your classroom. We talk so much about things like regulation and nervous system between Laura and I, if you've been to any of our past workshops as well. And so try to give you some different tools to use for yourself and for your learners as well. So for today's grounding activity, I do want to invite you to start by thinking about where you are right now and where you might be grounded. So if you are standing and planting your feet or sitting in a chair or another space, feel that space under you. You might even consider putting your palms on a desk just to keep your hands also grounded during this activity. Whatever makes you feel comfortable and rooted in this moment. So take a moment to feel the rootedness of where you are in your physical space. And we're going to do just a quick check-in with yourself. It's not something you have to share, but just kind of take a check-in and see on a scale from 1 to 10, how stressed are you feeling today or not stressed? So 1 being there's no stress in my life. I feel fully present where I am right now. And 10 being there's quite a bit of stress in my life and I'm having trouble with some of the things going on, managing them or being present in different spaces. So take an inventory for yourself where you feel on 1 to 10 before we start. All right, so once you arrived here, you're feeling grounded. You might even think about a sense of rootedness coming from your feet or your hands in your space, like the roots of a tree going down to keep you stable in this space, tendrils going down into the earth. And as you get there, I'll invite you to take 1 big breath in and a breath out. Awesome. Take 2 more of those. We're going to take 3 breaths now. Another breath in. Another breath out. And just notice your breath. You don't have to have any judgment on it. Just notice where you are. And 1 more. Okay, so now that you are grounding in this space, I want you to bring to mind an activity or a community or a relationship or a place where you feel a sense of belonging. So this could take a lot of different forms. There are a lot of ways in. It could be a specific person, it could be a group, it could be an event you attended, a community you're a part of. But picture that place, person, feeling in detail. Where are you for that? When you have a picture in your head, I want you to check in with your body and notice if there are any sensations or images you notice coming up when you feel that sense of belonging and when you hold that sense in your mind. How do you feel? And holding that sensation, go ahead and take another deep breath in. Take 2 more deep breaths at your own pace and take your time coming back into our space here with that sense of belonging with you.
Thanks, Amy. So if you're just coming in, welcome. We're just getting started, and we're going to start by talking a little bit about cultural competency in the classroom in a moment. Um, so we consider belonging as a human need for survival, and there's been a lot of talk about this in kind of pop psychology circles today. Belonging, the survival responses that get activated when we don't feel belonging. So we're not doing like a really deep look at this, but I just thought I would bring a few kind of thoughts to the table here, because again, we're thinking about, okay, why are we talking about the nervous system and we're talking about cultural competency together? And how important is our consideration of this, right? As we're working with our learners. So it turns out very, very important, right? So if we think about belonging, it's not just a human need, but a fundamental right and a principle from which all other needs get met. So thinking about connectedness to humanity, community, and meaning is what animates us to seek our basic needs. So when we're thinking about, okay, how are we centering the belonging in our learning communities, in what we're doing as part of what brings these topics together, I think, for me as an educator, for sure. So it's great to see some folks in the chat, and from so many different institutions and even around the country here, which is wonderful. And I wonder if you would be willing to share, those of you who would like to use the chat today, what is something that gives you a sense of belonging when you're in a newer group? And answer really, what is one thing that you do with your learners to support and encourage their sense of belonging? Because there are things that we all put in place already, and I think it would be wonderful to source a little bit from the group here. And as folks are sharing, we'll just take a moment for this. Amy, if you see some things come up, or if you have thoughts to share, please feel free to jump in. What
Yeah,
is
I will watch the chat here. One thing that comes to mind for me immediately is I need to know the names of other people in a group to feel like I belong there and have someone that I can walk up to and know by name. And so that's a really important thing for me in a classroom, that people have a chance to get to know the other learners who are in there and feel that they can both recognize someone and be recognized when they come in.
great? I'm going to share a small thing, which is that I love making individual contact with someone before, like meeting a group as a whole. So those informal moments before a class begins, you can turn to the person next to you, or unmute and make some kind of small connection. Those are really helpful for my sense of belonging in a group personally.
Absolutely. I can keep an eye on the chat, Laura, and let you know when things come in.
Please do. And if these occur to you and you would like to share as we go, please do. So let's begin practicing cultural competency in the classroom. So thinking here about education as a partnership that's about all of us and meeting our learners where we are. Cultural competency can mean many things. The phrase that comes to mind for me the most here is caring for the spectrum of difference. So thinking about how we set up environments and practices that communicate caring for the spectrum of difference. Amy, it looks like a few things.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Laura. So there are a couple of comments in here. We do want to make sure that we can share for the sake of the recording, and for anyone who may not be able to access the chat today. So Eliana shared, when people share their names, smile, and laugh, I feel much more comfortable. And I try to make sure we all know one another and honor where we come from. That includes sharing where we're from, but also providing lots of opportunities to share from funds of knowledge. Courtney shared, I like to make small compliments to others in a group, which helps me be more approachable and get others in the group open to chatting with me. And Susanna added, breaking bread. I love being able to share food with others. It really helps build connection for me. And with learners, I try to ensure that I am learning from them as well, trying to find out what they want to teach and share and giving space for their stories, interest, and lived experience.
Great, those are wonderful. Thank you so much. Great. So this is another invitation to use the chat. Just to throw in here, what does cultural competency mean to you, and why or how does it matter to the learners in your program? I know that you're all joining from really different programs, so I thought it might be really wonderful to hear briefly about what this concept of cultural competency means for you and what you think it means for your learners. So if you have a moment and you'd like to share that in the chat, that would be great. And Amy, if you can keep an eye on that, we'll come back to these answers as they show up.
Absolutely. And Laura, if I can just add, there's no like one right answer for that, right? Like there's so many different ways to approach it, and it is used in so many contexts. So that's why we'd love to hear how your experience has been.
Absolutely. Great. Okay. So I wanted to share a few of my own assumptions in putting this work together. Okay, so the assumption that when we're talking about cultural competency, we're talking about a dynamic, ongoing, and crucial process for creating both brave and safe learning communities. Right? So as a dynamic, ongoing, and crucial process, right? There's what we bring to the table. There's the way that our knowledge continues to evolve and be informed by our commitment to this practice, by our reflection, by our showing up, by the relationships that hold us accountable. And then this process is crucial, right, for creating a space where all of our learners can come together and learn. And the assumption here that I have is that process is not a solitary one, and that it requires courage. When we talk about safe spaces, we're also talking about brave spaces.
Monica added in here, I like to approach cultural competency as cultural openness. I don't know if you can be culturally competent in another culture, but I think being non-judgmental and open allows students to feel safe.
Great. I love that. Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think if we're thinking about openness, right, and curiosity, right, that can apply in so many contexts that might come up. I want to share for those who may want a definition, kind of like an expert-based definition. And I know there's been an evolution and a dialogue of the way these definitions can apply in adult education as elsewhere. And this is one of those slides where it's got a lot of text and the text is a little bit small. So this will be made available in an ongoing basis in case something gets lost in the translation here. But I wanted to share, this is one definition that I found from the National Center for Cultural Competency at Georgetown University, for cultural competency that I thought applied well to working with adult learners. So thinking about here, cultural competence, apologies. Cultural competence here as a set of behaviors, attitudes, and practices within a program or among individuals, enabling them to work effectively cross-culturally, referring to the ability to honor and respect the beliefs, language, interpersonal styles, and behaviors of individuals and families receiving services, in this case, education, right, coming together to learn, as well as the staff who are providing the services, and striving to achieve cultural competence as a dynamic, ongoing developmental process that requires a long-term commitment. Amy, are there any other thoughts that came through in the chat of how cultural competency applies to people who are here?
Not at this time.
Okay, great. So we can come back to this too. The point isn't that we all have the same exact expert-based definition, right? But, kind of know what's the relevancy of cultural competency in your own program. How do you define it and what do you do with it? Okay, so we're talked just a little bit about cultural competency. And so I just want to kind of say, okay, what does the nervous system have to do with it? Thinking about this from on the ground, again, being in the middle of teaching as an educator, as a layperson. So I'm thinking about how, for me, a nervous system centered approach really reminds us that we need to check in and make sure that we're regulated first before trying to hold space, address dysregulation for others. So this is one of the ways that thinking about these two things together and their interaction has been really useful for me, kind of as an accountability tool, right? Okay, am I checking in with my own nervous system regulation? What do I have space to hold today? If I don't have space to hold that, how can I make more? And then too, that interweaving of personal and social safety. So we understand cultural competency as an approach within a whole context of evolving conditions that all of our learners deal with on a daily basis that kind of intertwine together, including potential traumas and triggers, right? Not just in our classroom, but in the world at large, that all of our learners are constantly navigating. And this is maybe especially true when working with learners in high trauma impacted communities, but really it's just also true generally. We're going to look just a little bit today at the work of a social psychologist, Resmaa Menakem, who has worked with many different populations, including veterans, police, those who've experienced violence in community, and who does work around racial justice and trauma integration and bringing those two things together in his work. His work reminds us that trauma, including the trauma of our social conditions, it doesn't happen in theory, right? But it happens in the body. The nervous system is impacted by all of the range of triggers that fall under the work of cultural competency, and having the tools to recognize and work with this just gives us like more than just a top-down approach to thinking about these things, but some tools to work with.
Laura Courtney emphasized in the chat that addressing your own level of emotional capacity is so important.
Great, thank you so much. Absolutely. And I think that is part, for me at least, of that dynamic, ongoing process, commitment, and the importance of those relationships, right? That will be holding space for our reflective space for our own work as well. So Amy, I wondered, you had a few examples of places where you've seen personal safety and social safety kind of overlap in your own experience as an educator and practices, and I wondered if you'd be willing to share a couple of those here.
Yeah, so I've had a couple of experiences that really stood out when Laura and I were talking about this together. One was one workplace where I was, and there have clearly been times throughout United States history where there's been strong tensions between the United States government or different populations and the Muslim populations that are here in the United States. And there was a particularly tense political time while I was working at this institution. And part of our response to that, because we had a large number of students in this ESOL program who were from the Middle East, was to address that by working with the students. So students and staff worked together on how to make it clear that they had support where they were in the institution. And so they developed buttons that said, "I stand with Muslims against hate and fear." And a lot of staff and other students wore them together as a sign and symbol of that working together. Another one that came up is a friend who teaches in West Philly, and the students that she works with primarily come from the same community where she is. And so one of her practices is, if there is violence in the community, which affects the community as a whole, she sends out an email ahead of time to students to say, "I understand that this happened this week. Um, if this is affecting you in a way that you do not feel like you can come to class and participate this week, I fully understand. Please send me an email and we will make other arrangements with you." So just as a way of acknowledging those things and creating that sense of safety for everyone involved.
Thanks so much, Amy. I think those are really helpful illustrative examples. I'm thinking about, I've been teaching a gender studies class at a state university that deals with LGBT content and theorists. And Many of the students that I teach are hungry for a class that addresses that in the context of the rest of the curriculum. And certainly, like with the prevalence of bills coming up in state legislatures around the country that are limiting what can be taught in K through 12 schools. I have a lot of students who are education majors who will go on to teach in K through 12 environments. And even at the public university level, when these bills are up, it seems important to name that context and talk about it as part of what we're learning. So I'm thinking about naming those contexts as well. So these are just a few examples. I wanted to, again, make some space and invite those who are here if you'd like to contribute at this point. And if not, there will be time to talk in small groups later too, if you prefer. But you're invited to place in the chat for your learners, what concerns, practices, and considerations fall under the umbrella of cultural competency? This is a wide umbrella. So please take a moment if you would like to share. What concerns, practices, and considerations fall under the umbrella of cultural competency? And Amy, if you wouldn't mind keeping an eye.
Absolutely. We have a couple coming in now.
Great.
Um, so Susanna shared concerns under the umbrella of cultural competency would be times for fasting and prayer, for example. Eliana said requiring cameras to be turned on can be a problem for learners who are concerned with modesty, especially in a mixed gender classroom. I never require learners to have their cameras on. And Gretchen also added higher educational institutions, processes, and expectations.
Great. Thank you so much. These are great examples. Okay. And Amy, if more come in, please let us know.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to take a moment and consider this work from Resmaa Menakem, therapist, social worker. Here, the author has examined damage caused by racism in America from the perspective of trauma and body-centered psychology. He defines some different types of trauma and different types of body-centered trauma in the work. And just considering how important the body, not the thinking brain, is the place where we experience most of our pain, pleasure, and joy, where we process most of what happens to us. It's also where we do most of our healing. It's where we experience resilience and a sense of flow. So just wanting to center this moment, because I think bringing together cultural competency and the nervous system, again, as educators, the two are already really entwined. And so if we can take an approach that is capable of incorporating perspectives and tools, working with both, and it's going to get us further in our work. Okay, so this next few minutes here are going to be a little bit of a deep dive into the nervous system and some tools for co-regulation. Amy, I did see a few more things come through the chat, so I want to make space here in case it helps to share.
Yes. Okay. So Monica also added one thing I've noticed a lot of anger towards certain nationality because of war and navigating that anger while not promoting intolerance.
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. So how do we make space as we're teaching, for instance, for those kind of hot button moments when maybe a learner needs to share something that has a strong emotion or a lot of anger in it, without exactly as you're saying here, promoting intolerance, right? Or allowing for like the softness of a safety for everyone to kind of hear that. How do we navigate those moments? When do we dive into them? When do we contain them? Are part of the questions of this work. Okay, so thank you so much. We're going to come back to the classroom in a little bit. I want to take a bit of a deep dive here into some of these tools that have helped me from a practitioner perspective. Some of this information is gleaned from a year-long training for professionals who work with individuals and groups in somatic experiencing taught by the Trauma Institute. But again, this is not from the perspective of a mental health professional, nor neither Amy nor I are that. These are just kind of some tools and some information. It might get a little technical here. If you want to, feel free to sit back for the ride if that's not your thing. And we will be coming back to kind of how do we activate this in the classroom in a few moments. Okay. So thinking about the nervous system, I want to think about, or ask us to think about how we have this tool that's always kind of at the ready. So when dysregulation happens, when triggers happen, when moments of extreme conflict, misunderstanding, or where things seem to be veering off course, we always have this tool at the ready, and it is co-regulation. So we're going to define this in a moment and talk about some techniques for accessing this in the classroom. Some of this work, as I've said, comes out of work from the Trauma Institute, which is related to Dr. Peter Levine's work from his book, Waking the Tiger. Peter Levine looked at the way animals in the wild shake off trauma physically when it happens. And this was kind of the basis for some of the research that went into this work. The idea in this approach is that trauma is a fact of life. It's something that we all experience, and so is resiliency. So co-regulation is one way as educators we can support the resiliency of the individuals, but also the groups that we're working with. Okay. So considering the brain, thinking about kind of instinctually as educators or through experience or expertise, we know that it's not really possible for us to learn while stressed. Okay, so we're going to think about the brain a little bit to think about why. So there's two parts to the nervous system, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And I always mix up which is which, so I have written this down here. The parasympathetic governs our executive functioning. So this is our higher, kind of often called like our higher brain, like our ability to remember, plan, make new connections. It's required to learn. It's also our social engagement brain, how we can engage with others and how we can regulate our emotions in order to do so. While the sympathetic system governs our reptile brain. So the fight or flight mode, the fight, flight, or freeze mode. And as Amy has taught me, there's a few other reactions that kind of have now been mapped that go under there. And so that kind of fear brain, a threat has come up. When that part of the brain takes over, naturally, that is a sympathetic. And freeze is the mode, right, when our sympathetic brain is activated, and it's kind of hijacking the parasympathetic in this freeze mode where our social engagement systems shut off. And so without going too deeply into the neuroscience, I think one thing that's important to consider is that when the sympathetic brain is activated, the parasympathetic brain is turned off, right? So one mode or the other mode is kind of taking over. So when we kind of can see it like a learner who's like in that state, if we can recognize some of the signs, yeah, there's not the capacity to be accessing executive functioning, memory, planning, the things that we need in order to learn in that moment, right? While that response is happening. We are all fully capable of both. This is what I'm trying to say. And we are all kind of naturally wired to have both sets of our nervous system. So it's not wrong or bad when the parasympathetic freeze reaction comes along, or when the sympathetic reaction of fight or flight comes along. It's not wrong or bad. That's part of healthy nervous system response to a threat. Is the other kind of insight of Dr. Levine's work here. So regulation in the nervous system, this is like when things are going as they should, healthfully, well, say, it doesn't mean being calm all the time. Our systems are built to deal with stress. So again, stress is a fact of life, right? Whether for animals in the wild or people today, now, many things can cause stress. It means that our nervous system has natural systems of responding to threat with a period of activation, checking out the environment, continuing to activate or deactivate as appropriate, right? And those take place within this kind of middle zone here, which is these dotted lines in this system, this is where we can operate, where our system has the capacity to be activated and then deactivated because we are noticing the signs. Oh, there's a threat. I'm looking around. Is that truly a threat? I'm checking this out. I'm responding appropriately, right? So this is kind of the functioning of the regulation in a nervous system. So for instance, a word that came up earlier was the word curious. When my nervous system is regulated, I feel curious. I'm open. I want to know about the experiences of the people around me. I want to know where I am. I feel open, relaxed, alert. We can see the impact of trauma in the nervous system. And trauma is defined by Dr. Levine and elsewhere as an event that is too much for these systems of regulation and that kind of gets stuck in the system. So the system might get stuck in on or off mode. On might look like extreme flight or extreme fight response, right? Off mode might look like a freeze response. Um, and Okay, so I want to back up a little bit because there's a lot of like technical language and I don't know what everyone's coming in with. So by dysregulation, what are we talking about? Like we might see that from the outside, and as like the lack of a pause between an impulse and a response. So you come in with a stressor, and suddenly there's like rage and someone's like throwing their books on the table or something. There's a small moment, right, of say dysregulation, like a lack of a pause between impulse and response. Um, Stressful morning, my 7-year-old, throws their food for the third time in a row, and instead of the pause, right, I'm yelling, I'm yelling. We're not talking here when we talk about dysregulation in the nervous system as a whole about these everyday stressors that we all experience, that our system is built to handle that moment of stress and then re-regulate. We're talking about getting stuck on a point in that wave. And the other thing I want to say here is that you see kind of a picture of like a traumatic event coming in, and that event can be of any magnitude. We know that people and nervous systems experience events differently. So it's not a question of like, oh, well, how bad was that event that caused X, Y, or Z? We can all experience the same event in different ways. For some, it might be traumatizing or re-traumatizing or dysregulating, and for other systems, perhaps not. That's kind of important to say here. Okay, so these are kind of modes of chronic stress. All right, so we're talking about and these are just some photos, but the idea here is we're talking about zones of regulation. So one way that we can stay in that middle zone is by resourcing. We kind of often will do this without thinking about it too much. Something stressful happens and you just take a breath, right? Or maybe look at the window, or touch. I touch, my wedding ring. Maybe I might feel my feet on the floor. I have a friend who likes to notice. he he walks through the day, kind of re-regulating himself by noticing the really funny and odd things that people do. So like leaving a cup of coffee on a park bench instead of throwing it away. My friend will always see that every time and kind of laugh about it. Um, this resourcing, one source of resourcing is what we call co-regulation, and this is a good news because this is a source of help to us. um, okay. Okay. Co-regulation is this ability to regulate the emotions, behaviors, soothe and manage stressors when they happen with the support of a connecting individual or group. So that individual or group can come in and be a resource in those moments of stress when something begins to dysregulate. We think about this in terms of why it matters for us and how it can be a tool. It's this neat thing that our nervous systems can do with opportunity, without effort, or can be trained and invited to do. We don't have to necessarily think about it because it's part of our social engagement kind of wiring, right? So when we think about, okay, we could either have that fight or freeze response or that social engagement response. Well, that social engagement response kicking in, that's part of what allows us to regulate and be using those other parts of our nervous system. We're not really meant to do this on our own or to kind of like buck up and do it on our own. This is something that the support and safety of the group is meant to provide, to kind of return us to that place. And this is where I really come back to this idea that belonging is a survival need. some other kind of concepts here that are taught in SE, Somatic Experiencing through the Trauma Institute and Dr. Peter Levine that I found helpful as an educator to think about are concepts like, a group is meant to regulate, to co-regulate to the most regulated nervous system. So we hear a lot today about how fear is contagious and can be contagious, right? And with co-regulation, when the space is provided for that, right? Regulation is kind of contagious too, right? But it's not like that's a simple process or taken for granted process. And we're absolutely not talking about telling someone to calm down, right? So that's not what co-regulation might look like. But holding space as a group while our own system is regulated, holding space for a group to process the stress that is real and that is there. So I also think about this as an educator because it's real that the feelings and behavior of the people we're in close proximity to also directly impact how we feel, all of us. And this is part of co-regulation as well. Okay. Okay, so these are just a few principles here of what this might look like for teaching, and I think that we could all kind of come up with our own, especially you all shared you teach in many different areas and programs. So these are just some principles that I'm kind of culling that I hope might be a helpful example. So thinking about establishing our own safety first and prioritizing safety in the plan. So how can we plan for those moments when we might become dysregulated ourselves, right? And so noticing when that's happening, noticing what may or may not be triggering that, and making a plan for when that is going to happen. What resources are we going to draw on? Building trust over time with our learners, with accountability. There's an educator, Jose Antonio Bowen, whose work we'll look at in a moment, who wrote a book called Teaching Change, who talks a lot about the relationship between educator and student and how essential that relationship is for learning. So how we can build into those relationships the opportunity for co-regulation, again, which isn't being told to calm down. Yeah. And then establishing structures and rhythms, for instance, for our learners can be a helpful way of making space for regulation within a group setting. Making space for breaks and fissures when they're going to happen and planning for those in our curriculum design, in our activities. Addressing moments of turbulence when they happen instead of kind of sailing over them and pretending they don't happen when we have the opportunity. And again, this is one you want to think about, like how regulated are we in holding space? What are other goals? And where is it productive to move into a moment of conflict versus needing to contain it or address it later or follow up after the class or even on another day, for instance. And then being honestly available for connection. So thinking about those moments like before the class officially starts or after a class has ended. How are we available for even just small one-on-one moments of social engagement? Okay, so I'm going to move through this a little bit more because I hope that you can see that these are some examples of kind of culling this information and applying it to our teaching. And then thinking here about techniques and tools that we can take with us and what this looks like. So I'm thinking, for example, when someone really needs to share something, there's something burning that really needs to be said, making space for that and incorporating it into the material. Ways to follow up when someone is really confused, showing a lot of confusion about an assignment or a task, maybe following up later by email is an appropriate way, or after the class in a conversation. I mean, it's going to vary so much depending on our context, how we're going to reach out. And I know that's something that Amy talked about a lot in previous workshops. Okay, thinking about how these things are small, they're not maybe rocket science, but kind of reframing things that we might already be doing in the context of like, okay, this is to support the individual regulation and or the co-regulation of a group. When are the breaks? What is it okay to do in the space? Does everyone know each other's names and how to pronounce those names accurately? Have I made space for questions, right, in the lesson? If I'm approaching a really new, difficult set of material, have I admitted that it's difficult? Have I adjusted the pace of where we're going? So these kinds of practices that we might already do as educators, thinking about them as also a source of co-regulation. Okay, and here's a slide where I'm going to move on for time's sake, but this is going to be available to you as well if these kind of examples are helpful. So some other ways we can think about this looks, taking time to breathe together at the beginning of class, planning breaks between big concepts, taking the time to do what Amy invited us to do today, naming our internal weather or our stress level coming in and making space to hear it, setting aside time for our learners to air their difficulties to one another and to us, managing our expectations, intervening appropriately if someone is dominating in discussion, for instance, attending to what voices feel comfortable participating with, checking in if someone hasn't spoken all term, taking movement breaks during the material. Okay, and then thinking about some kind of just tips for practice or ground rules that kind of go back to drawing on what we know about co-regulation. So thinking about if we're not regulated ourselves, we can't support regulation. It's both something that happens naturally and something we can source from in our teaching. We're not trying to be mental health professionals. So knowing kind of what our rules are and what is comfortable and how we might be wanting to hold space and then making that container clear. Regulation is about being in that sweet spot. It's not about being calm and unaffected, right? So moments of dysregulation are not a failure. They're often responses to real or perceived threat. Right? And then thinking about titration a little bit goes a long way. So when we're talking about co-regulation, right, if there's a small shift in a group, that can write a process, create a little bit of space to access. So that might not look like someone's having a really hard day, like, oh, name 5 things that are good. It might look like a moment of breath in something that is hard. All right, and then I'm not going to go through these in particular because these are my ground rules, but what I feel is important is that if we're approaching this work from a trauma-informed perspective and a cultural competency perspective, we have some ground rules for ourselves, kind of like a compass or a North Star. And I have a picture here. It's a little hard to see of an oxygen mask because for me, that one of like, okay, put on your own oxygen mask first, or maybe it's in tandem, right? Making sure that I'm regulated is a big one, sort of for me personally. But just thinking about like taking a few moments in your teaching to think about, okay, what are the ground rules that you bring that feel important to you in your work? Again, so these slides will be available later for anyone who wants to peruse the specifics here. Okay, so this is also from Menneken's work. He reminds us trauma is not a flaw or a weakness. It's a highly effective tool of safety and survival. Trauma is also not an event. Trauma is the body's protective response to an event or a series of events it perceives as potentially dangerous. And so again, just a reminder of the social context that we don't always see that may be invisible to us. The cultural context, the family context, the religious practices, and navigating all the daily things that it takes to come to a class, especially when it's living in a high poverty situation, or high trauma situation, right? And so the reminder of just all of the many social contexts in which our learners come to us directly from, and in which there's a potential for trauma or re-traumatization to occur. And just a reminder to us that when we see dysregulation, it's not, again, it's not a failure or bad, it's the body's natural and evolutionary way of preparing to meet a threat. So I'm needing to kind of consider both contexts when we craft a response. And then lastly in this section, I did just want to mention briefly trauma exposure response. This is information, just a tiny taste of information from this book called Trauma Stewardship by Laura Vandermoot Lipsky. And I can put all of these book titles in the chat for anyone who is interested in further work here. But the idea here is that if we do work in in groups of people who have high exposure to trauma, we can take on a secondary trauma exposure response, and that can happen when we're working with communities who experience trauma that we've experienced, or perhaps we haven't. Either way. And this kind of ties back to our conversation of co-regulation, how nervous systems can sync up, and how important it is to lean into those co-regulation techniques. So this is just a little bit more about, okay, what is secondary trauma response? How do we maybe think about wanting to recognize this? Ways in which the world looks and feels like a different place to you as a result of your work, or allowing ourselves to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, surrendering to too many demands, too many projects. These are just some of the ways that I can look. We're thinking about building trust with our learners, and the way that a trauma exposure response can kind of really deteriorate our capacity to build that trust. I just wanted to go over just a few of the signs that Vandermoot Lipsky talks about in her work. And again, apologies for moving fast. I do want to just kind of move us through now, and then this will be available to you to go back if this is an area that you'd like to look at more. So hypervigilance, things like diminished creativity, minimizing. So these can be very different types of responses, right? Feeling like we have to do everything all at once, all the time, right? Anger, cynicism, or these are just some. And the authors here go through like sort of 16 signs of trauma exposure response. And these authors, again, I'll take us through this a little bit quickly, but they talk about some approaches to reorienting. And Amy and I are working on this a little bit now. I'm sorry, working on some workshops to present about this in the future. The authors break down kind of like 4 major areas of consideration when we notice that we might have taken on some secondary trauma response. And they present some kind of daily rituals, reflective exercises that you can do that engage kind of each of these areas. So the idea is to stay engaged, not to disengage. And so I'm thinking about really like just small daily rituals before and after teaching, looking out the window, journaling, texting a friend, enjoying like a cup of coffee for a moment, small rituals and interventions during, like for instance, taking screen breaks. It turns out that the gaze that we use for the screen, for a hard focus on a screen, is associated with that sympathetic nervous system response. And so even taking a moment to kind of look away from a screen, let your eyes relax, take in the room as a whole, can be a reminder to re-engage your social engagement and executive functioning brain. And then when I first started teaching, I would kind of bring an important teaching mentor to mind. I would feel the ground beneath my feet. So these kind of small things that we can put in place for ourselves, they don't have to be big. in the same way that that we can put in small things for our learners as well, from the perspective of the kind of lens of cultural competency, meeting what we know about nervous system functioning. We can build in small things to the structures we're already doing. Okay, and so I was going to invite everyone to just reflect on this question, but I think what I want to do for time is just pose it. And if this is something that comes back and you want to share with your group or with either of us later, please feel free. So just thinking about when you notice that you're out of balance in your role, and how can you tell? What does that look like, or how does it feel like? And then what helps to recenter you in your work? Okay, so I want to spend just a few minutes here kind of culling some ideas about, okay, what does cultivating brave spaces look like? So how can we put together this little taste of nervous system functioning from this, 20 minutes, the past 20 minutes, and from whatever else you're sourcing and how do we put together these kind of tools of working with nervous systems in a group with concepts and frameworks and practices from cultural competency as educators. And the first thing I wanted to ask you to do is, if you would like to use the chat today, please go ahead sharing your wins. So just thinking about what is a difficult moment that you've gone through in teaching and where what helped you kind of get through it, where you felt like you moved through the moment, not just sort of like getting through it, right? But in a way that kind of contributed to the experiences of that learner or the group as a whole. So I invite you to kind of consider this question. Please do share in the chat if you would like to. Amy, please do keep an eye on that chat. And
Yeah.
Great. Did you have a thought, Amy?
Yeah, I can share a quick thought as well. Something that would often throw me off in a classroom is um, when a student would respond to a concept, especially as adult learners, that they had previously worked with in their education, especially in like the high school equivalency type work, that was frustrating to them, and immediately shut it down. So they might see, something in math that had come up when they were in school before, and it just brings up all of these emotions. And it seems to me in a moment that initially it's this like, well, it's not that big a deal, right? We're just starting. It's okay. But in that learner, it's bringing up something different. So for me, learning to take a pause there and try to get a little bit more to the root, like, is this something we've seen before? Like maybe just sourcing a little bit, like, what do you know about this? What can be frustrating about these fractions or whatever they are coming up, before just trying to pass that off can be a win.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. Great. Really helpful to have that example to chew on.
I'll
Yeah,
keep an eye out for other examples as well.
math can be so emotional.
Absolutely.
Okay, so keeping in mind that our larger goal here is moving from reacting to responding. What is a response that we want to craft, prepare for ahead of time, kind of set the stage for, come back to? So I guess what I'm proposing here, or sharing from my own perspective as an educator, a practice of using kind of a cultural competency lens or framework, and also using co-regulation techniques. So I have a picture of the 3D glasses because I'm thinking about trying to see things in 3D, personal safety and social safety being entwined, right? And when I say see, it's kind of an imperfect metaphor because this has to do with conversations, not as presumptions, right? And then co-regulation techniques. I have a picture of a piano because I personally played it and had to do a lot of scale practice over and over. And I'm just thinking about practice and the idea of retraining our own nervous system and the system of a group. And it happens in these small little moments or shifts. So that's kind of why how I'm picturing these two together, but there's not a right way. So please feel free. I hope that everyone here has your own understanding of how these might work with one another. Amy, I think there's a
Yeah.
message in the chat.
Yes, we have a couple of examples. Carmen said that they were working with a senior recently, and it was very humbling. They were telling me that they had a certain type of computer, and in trying to share on Zoom, so I ended up making a home visit, and it was very humbling and overwhelming. Too much to mention, but seniors can live very sad and lonely lives, it would appear. And Susanna contributed, I feel really grateful for the ways that learners have modeled co-regulation, apologies, or shared strategies with each other for adjusting to life in this country, moving through a challenging experience, etc. And I do feel like so much of my work is creating a web of support in the class where we can all feel held by each other. I love this emphasis on practice and retraining our own nervous system and the freedom that it gives us as practitioners to never feel done or there isn't perfection to have to strive for. We may have to keep retraining.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both so much for that. Absolutely great. Um, and I want to leave space for more genuine conversation too. Not genuine, I mean like extended, for you all to talk with each other in groups. So we're going to transition to small groups in just a moment. And there will be time to pick up these ideas and questions with for those who would like to. Absolutely. So thank you so much. There's always so much more to be gleaned from a group of educators. So again, this is another slide that I'm going to move through quickly, where I want this information to be here to just kind of peruse and come back to. But what I hope this is an opportunity to is kind of like reflect and group source. Okay, so I just wanted to give some examples of sort of tools and approaches that might have to do with kind of bringing together these things. So thinking about before, during, and after, and that's both before, during, and after teaching, right? How we are preparing the space for ourselves and our learners, entering the room or setting up the room or the online environment, following up after with things that may have happened during, and how we choose which approach, and then also before, during, and after those moments of hot button moments or moments of conflict arise. Often, I mean, Amy and I have had this come up in earlier workshops, and certainly I've had it come up for myself in my teaching, which is like, okay, what do I do when, right? And then there's that kind of hot button moment or that hard moment when some learners might be triggering one another, or the material is triggering, right? And so much of it also might have to do with that preparation of laying that groundwork for a group that can practice some co-regulation before that moment, which might create more resiliency and ability to reintegrate when those inevitable triggers, misunderstandings, moments of conflict do arise. And they do, right? And so thinking about building in a pause, taking a break, time to reflect, thinking about stating the problem. This is one that I do a lot. This came up earlier that sometimes like programs and curricula can have material that is problematic or triggering built into it, right? That we might be contractually obliged to present, right? So how do we like deal with that? Or being part of a program or a department or a curriculum that might have its own issues around cultural competency, and how might we deal with that. So I'm thinking a lot about sort of like stating the problem, or our own transparency, and the role that that can take in just inviting space for conversation, and then our ability for relationship. Okay, so there's more here obviously to talk about. These are a few. And then I did just want to share, from my own experience teaching in a community college in Washington State. I found myself teaching, English 101, and had 75 students a semester, and I was teaching in a community college that had students come in speaking over 140 languages from 90 different countries. And so one thing that I noticed right off the bat in my classes was that the learners all had really different expectations, or I shouldn't say all, but many had quite different expectations from one another and from me of what the classroom was going to be. and what my role was and what their role was and what the responsibilities were and how formal or informal the relationship was. And so just thinking about how um, it is just kind of one example of the many that fall under the umbrella of cultural competency, thinking about, okay, what do we do when these clashing expectations come up? Who do our learners expect us to be? How do we know? What do we do when there's dissonance around our role? In this book, Teaching Change by Jose Antonio Bowen, he really talks about the importance of the educator's relationship. He points out that, as educators, part of what we want is to create the space for our learners to actually change their minds, to actually go into brave territory, learn from one another, learn from disagreement, challenge original assumptions. I think this can be true no matter what we're teaching, right? And so Bowen points out how important this relationship is with the educator. And talking about when triggers happen, one of the things that he recommends is, when someone is triggered, we put safety first. That's not the moment to challenge that person. That person might be probably quite capable of being challenged in many other moments, but that might not be the moment to push, right? So thinking about how we plan for triggers or deal with them. For Bowen, he also talks about how we structure material in lessons. If we have material in our lessons that is potentially triggering, maybe we don't put it at the beginning, right, of a learning unit. How are we building up to it? How are we building the trust to have those difficult conversations before we're putting it in place? He talks about how, like, you wouldn't brush some lint off of a stranger's shoulder if you met them on the street. But if your partner had some lint on their shoulder, you might brush that off without thinking, right? So how are we building trust? What is the appropriate level of trust building, and when is it appropriate in our curriculum to address that kind of material? And so I kind of want to leave us before we go into breakout groups with this quote from Bowen's work, Teaching Change. He says, "Remember learning to ride a bike. You were willing to try something scary because you knew someone was holding on to you. In the classroom, anticipate when content will be hard for students, for our learners, and articulate this difficulty and what you'll do to help." So I think for Bowen, it's really like this, the resilience that we're talking about today, it's not something extra. It's really at the heart of what we're doing as educators if we want our learners to be learning and to be in a safe and brave space to learn. And so this requires stepping out of one's comfort zone. It requires a difficulty to do things that are difficult, have difficult conversations. So if we plan ahead of time for dysregulation, if we put some simple doable things in place that can support the kind of nervous systems as a whole in our class environments and structures to support regulation, that's not an extra, right? That's like kind of at the heart of what we're planning for as educators. So thank you all so much for all of your attention. And Amy, I'm wondering if you can make some breakout rooms for us. These are the questions, but really anything you want to talk about with your group. And I would just ask, if you prefer not to participate in the breakout rooms, that's fine. Thank you so much for being here today. But will you either not join your room in that case, or don't put a message up just so your group knows that you're not participating. I'm going to share in the chat a Google Doc that has these questions in it. So that everyone, once you get to your room, you have the questions. But really, anything you want to talk about that came up today is very welcome. We should have about 10 to 15 minutes in your room with your group.
So Laura, just a quick note, we had a number of people who had to hop off around 1 o'clock today. And so we have about 4 folks still with us. Do you want to just do a large group discussion, or do you still want to do some breakout?
I think a large group discussion is great, Amy.
Okay. I would prefer the large group.
Let's do that. Great.
Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you. Amy, how do you feel about taking the lead on this one?
Sure. Yes. Do you mind if I just take a moment to read through the questions? We have an idea of what to bring today and then invite people to share from that.
let's all do that.
You want
Okay.
me to pause recording?
That would
Yeah,
be
let's do that, Charles. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you so much to everyone who shared and who is here today. I will put, I'm happy to put my email in the chat just in case questions or issues come up that you'd like to discuss later by email. Feel free to reach out. And the next session will be back here with Amy for Beginner's Mind, scaffolding, reteaching, and making a lesson plan on Friday, June 2nd, from 10 to 11:30 a.m. and would love to have you back. So thank you everyone so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. Looking forward to seeing you again.